We started this lesson last week, a series of lessons, if you will, on Moses. And Moses is an encouragement. He's a great example for us. And if you ever feel down on yourself, I want you to hang in there. I want you to keep faith. I want you to remember that Moses himself was once a basket case. So there's hope for you. But we looked, Pam's shaking her head. She's as proud of me right now as she would be Ernie. But Moses is a great example, and someone who, despite their own weaknesses, I think, sets a great example of pressing forward and being willing to do what God asked him to do and what God needed him to do. And so, as we noted last week, we talked about the first 40 years of Moses' life, and that is summed up as Moses in the palace of Pharaoh. I noted last week that Amanda said, "Mike, you're never going to make it through this whole sermon." I said, "I think if I keep focused, I can." And she said, "No, I don't think you can." That's how much we covered, was that first point. Moses in the palace of Pharaoh. But tonight, Lord willing, we hope to cover these next 3 points. The second 40 years of Moses' life, we see him in the pastures of Jethro, to be followed by the passage of Jericho. And finally, as we know, this is at the end of his 40 years, or after the 40 years of Moses' physical life. While he was in the flesh, we read of the pinnacle of Nebo. And as I have there in parentheses, the young ones will note those are words from the great philosopher Buzz Lightyear and beyond. Because Moses' life does not end in Nebo. And so, looking at the palace of Pharaoh, we note that he was born into perilous times. And Connie actually asked me a question that brought up a great point last week. And by no means does this diminish the perilousness of Moses' time, but I always perceived the killing of the Hebrew babies to be an extended period of time. But Connie asked me, she said, "How long did that killing take place?" Because Aaron is just 2 years older than Moses. In fact, as I studied it, and there's no definitive answer to this whatsoever, but it does seem that God did not let this go on. That Moses was born into a perilous time, and while the spiritual state of the Hebrew people was not in a good state at all, was not in a good place, we do see numerous people standing up and taking important stances, being the Hebrew midwives and Moses' parents, and very likely others who are willing to stand up for what's right, regardless of what's wrong. And so the fact that there is perilous times by no means should be an excuse used by Christians to not accomplish the Word of God. And one of the reasons for that, we noted from, as we used this passage again this morning, from Hebrews, the 4th chapter and verse 13, that all creatures are naked and exposed before him, the eyes of him of whom we must give an account. And that means that not only is our souls open and exposed, naked and exposed to God, but our trials are naked and exposed to God. He sees what we're going through. He knows the trials. I'm mindful of the book of Revelations we studied a few months ago. It's over and over in those 7 letters to the churches in Asia. Jesus said, "I know your works. I know your trials. I know what you've suffered." And such was the case in the time of Moses, and is the case for our time today. We also noted that Moses had godly parents. In fact, the subtitle for this first point is God preserves Moses. And though he was born into perilous times, we see that God used godly parents to deliver him. And I think there's a good reminder for us as parents to be mindful of our obligation to deliver our children, to allow God to use us to deliver our children from the perilous times. Thirdly, in the palace of Pharaoh, we noted the providence of God. And thanks be for the providence of God. Because while all these things are going on, and I noted, and I really encourage you, regardless of what translation you read from, read Hebrews, the 11th chapter from the King James, because it keeps better, I think, than any of the other translations, that poeticness of the original author's words, of contrasting. Notice, if you would, in Christians' reading, that Moses chose to suffer with Christ rather than to be esteemed with the people of Pharaoh. The reproach of God rather than the riches of Egypt. That he fixed his eyes on the invisible rather than that which could be seen. Those strong and very important contrasts. We see all these things around us today, but God is at work. And certainly we see in the time of Moses that he was at work. And then lastly, we noted that God is preparing Moses. This maybe would have been a good subtitle or underlying idea for our message this morning. That when we go through the trials, when we go through the prolonged difficulties and the enormous pain and suffering of this present time, we should be mindful that God is preparing us. He's preparing us ultimately for that rest that we studied about this morning. But he likely is preparing us for challenges to come and for usefulness to come ahead. And certainly was the case for Moses. It's interesting to me in Exodus, the 2nd chapter, verse 23 through 25, that we see that God remembers and that God respects the cries of those Hebrew people. He remembers the promise that he made to Abraham. And so, in my mind, God surely would have sent a warrior, would have sent an army, would have sent several stealth fighters or stealth bombers. He sends, as I used a pun earlier, a basket case to help these people. God takes his time preparing Moses. He makes sure he has a great education. We're going to talk in weeks to come throughout this series about keeping our faith amidst a secular education. And it's quite possible today that we put too high of an emphasis on our secular educations. Certainly they cannot succeed or they cannot take preeminence over God in any way, and certainly should not in the lives of our children or in our own lives. But God uses Moses' education. In fact, in Acts 7:22, we see that he becomes mighty in word and deed. I've oftentimes seen a conflict between what Moses said and at the burning bush when he says, I can't speak. We see Stephen in his defense in Acts the 7th chapter say he was mighty in words. I think that it's not necessarily true that Moses is just making an excuse to get away from what he doesn't want to do. I think it's very likely Moses did not speak well. What Stephen is talking about is that there's power in education. Moses, through the providence of God, was prepared to go before the throne of Pharaoh, would have known the laws, would have known the procedures, and uses that very education to help guide him along the way. Yet he never forgot, as we move on to Stephen's defense in Acts 7:25, the plight of his brother. And eventually, he can't take it anymore as he's out and about and he sees a Hebrew brother being assaulted, being mistreated. And he exacts revenge. But we notice that it was not God's time. When we hear no from God, I think it's important to realize it may not be an eternal no. Moses received a big slap on the wrist here. Now, I don't want to encourage through any of my shortcomings or my faults, but I think this illustrates the point very well. The first date I ever took Amanda on, at the end of the night I leaned over and I was going to give her a little peck on the cheek. Boy, she flinched back in horror. You know, Bob, it was a long time before I ever tried that again, right? That was a strong learning experience for me. And, you know, Moses has his hand slapped here and has a bad experience. Does that mean that Moses is not to be a leader? Does that mean that Moses cannot accomplish what God is going to call him to do? No, it means it's not time yet. He had to learn more. He had to be prepared. And so, when the time was right, Stephen goes on to tell in chapter 7, 30 through 36, that God then uses him, this man who was cast out, to deliver the people. Of course, there's a type and antitype there of Jesus Christ. There are so many parallels. There's meant to be parallels between Moses and Jesus Christ. The one who was rejected and cast out becomes the deliverer. And so for the first 40 years of Moses' life, we see that God preserves Moses. Now he will use Moses to preserve his people. And so with that, Moses is out there and he takes the life of the Egyptian soldier, and it minds in the eyes of the Egyptians for no good cause whatsoever. And so he goes out the next day, and of course, he's taken precautions. Exodus, the 2nd chapter, verses 11 and 12, read this way. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens and saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Notice all the precautions that Moses takes. And oftentimes we picture Moses as being overtaken in the heat of rage and killing this Egyptian. I've become convinced otherwise, especially when we compare the readings of the Hebrew writer, saying that Moses chose the reproach of Christ rather than the treasures of Egypt. Moses makes a decision here that he's going to stand up for his people, and so he takes precautions. He looks this way, and he looks that way. And just like you've thought. Right, kids? Right, Debbie? No one saw me. It's all good. Well, guess what, kids? You aren't the only ones to think that. Moses thought it, and all the adults in here have thought it. So he looks this way and that way. And then afterwards, he covers it up. Chris and I played ball in the house despite being told numerous times not to do it. So when the vase broke, we put it all together, sat gently in the corner, hope Stephanie touched it. Right? So Moses hides the body in the sand. He takes precautions. They weren't enough. Notice in verse 14, he comes back and he sees now this time 2 Hebrews fighting amongst themselves. Now I'm going to come back to verse 13. We read, when he went out next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to one man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? Verse 14, he answered, who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Uh-oh. There were eyeballs Moses didn't account for. And so Moses is rejected. Moses is presumptuous in thinking that the people are going to lead him. And Moses is wrong. I'll ask you, are those failures? And we'll come back to them. God continues to prepare Moses because he leads. I have this picture here. I want to illustrate where Midian is because this is Egyptian. It dawned on me just tonight is in my final preparations that this is a border of Egyptian domain that is not timely to the time of Moses. That the actual Egypt of that time would have been down here. This is, I believe, the now with the Red Sea. But Midian's out here, right? Moses has to flee. He has to travel quite a distance out into the wilderness, away from civilization, away from all the luxuries that he's had. And there, Moses' preparations continue. In verse 24 and 25 of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, we read again of this decision that Moses has made. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. I emphasize these points from Hebrew because it's important to understand that Moses is not just falling into these leadership roles. He's made a decision. He knew who he was. And by the way, how did he know who he was? It had to be his mother. It's the only influence that we read of him being able to keep in his life, those godly parents, in particular, his mother. And so, having made that decision, he's forced to flee to Midian. Now, there's a point here that I have missed throughout all my studies, and I think it's an important discovery. It's an important point to not overlook. Moses had learned leadership, but he learned Egyptian leadership. What's Moses going to learn out there in the pasture? Remember Stephen? And by the way, Stephen's the one that's speaking in Acts, the 7th chapter. It was speaking about Moses that we just read a few months ago. Remember how he came into Scripture? Serving tables or doing what we would call a deacon today. Helping the widows, the Hellenistic widows, to receive what they needed. You see, in the world, we learn to be a leader by climbing to the top. In Christ, it's a little bit different. It's interesting to me that the percentage of psychopaths that are CEOs, it's still a low percentage, but it's double the percentage of psychopaths in the general population. Why would that be? I read one analysis of the situation to be this. Psychopaths are pretty good at causing a lot of trouble. When everything's all stirred up and everyone's fighting, everyone's losing their mind, they're the only ones that's calm. And so they get promoted. Again, it's a low percentage. I can't remember exact percentage, but I think it's around 3% of the population is considered to suffer from, or considered to be a psychopath. So that means it's 6% of CEOs. It's not a high number, but it's still significant. It's double the general population. I draw that out to say that the way we get true leadership in the church is the exact opposite. We go to the bottom. Remember what Jesus said when all the disciples are sitting around the table right before he goes to give his life for them? They're saying, I'm going to be the greatest. I'm going to be the greatest. Then shortly they were picking sides. Peter's got it. No, James is going to have it for sure. And Jesus quietly starts washing feet. says, you see, my kingdom is going to be different. You see, Moses stomped out there and he was going to take leadership by force. He was going to show them how it was going to be done. He was going to strike those that stood in his way down. God said, you need to go out here into the pasture. The Egyptians abhorred shepherds. These verses, we don't have time. I joke about preaching till midnight, but if we went to all these references, we would be here. So I encourage you to write them down. Genesis 43 and 32, as well as chapter 46 and 34, Exodus 8 and verse 26, are all examples of Egyptians hating shepherds and sheep, for that matter. In fact, Exodus 8 and 26 is when Moses is asking for the people to be able to sacrifice to God. And Pharaoh says, do it here. He says, no. We know that what we're going to do is abominable to the Egyptians. They were going to sacrifice sheep. The Egyptians abhorred them. Well, guess what? Moses becomes a shepherd. I've used this example before, but it's ever so important. You can't drive sheep. You can drive horses. You can drive cattle. But you've got to lead sheep. We serve a Savior who left glory, who left heaven, who left majesty and honor to come to this earth and to lead his sheep by example. Moses became a shepherd. Moses is now 80 years old. And the hardest work of his life is yet before him. It's amazing to me how many different ways our world is able to get us to divide and stay away from each other. We do it on sex, we do it on age, we do it on race, we do it on politics, we do it on demographics, we do it in all kinds, social economic standing. Right? We do it on so many different levels. We find a reason why this person's less valuable than me. That person isn't quite as good. We don't want to be around that person for this reason. Moses starts to lead at age 80. I think many would say you're too old. We have president running. In fact, we've had some that approach 80. One of the debates that come up is how are they too old? Right? How? My historian's not here. Sure, it's an inconvenience. How old was Ronald Reagan when he got reelected? Anyone know? Someone's Googling, I'm sure. Our official Googler's not here tonight either. But it was a factor, right? Came up in the debates. Moses was 80 years old when he starts to lead. Jehoshaphat was 8 years old when he started to rule. Josiah, right? Josiah. I think Josiah, not Jehoshaphat. Oh, okay, she's with me. Josiah was 8 years old when he starts to be king. Timothy was young. Moses was old. Right? There's all kind of ways that the world looks for us to divide. God's looking for people that are going to work for his kingdom, work hard for his kingdom. How many times have you heard it? And we hear it on both sides, right? I'm too young to be involved with that. Maybe later. Or my work's done, right? I did my turn. Let someone else do it now in the church. We serve in a kingdom where there's no retirement. There is retirement, it just comes after this life. Right? Now our rules change, right? Bob told us a few year or so ago that if I held the ladder, or someone held the ladder for him, he was going to go up and clean these lights out front. They've been cleaned twice since then, Bob. But Dad's in business meeting. Dad looked down and says, Bob, I think we'll keep you off the ladder. Now, Bob's rules changed, right? But we all have a part. We all have a role to play out. The people on the path to Jericho were being proven, right? They were being tested. They were tested by hunger. They were tested by thirst. They were tested by bitter water. They were tested with serpents. They were tested with the good food back in Egypt. They're being tried over and over again. Of course, they come right up to the border of Canaan, of the promised land, and they're being tested. Will you move forward? And they choose to send 10 spies. They already had the greatest intelligence that the world ever knew. God had scoped the land out, but they send 10 spies. And conclude from that, it can't be done. The people were being tried. But Moses was being tried. If you would turn your Bibles to Numbers, the 10th chapter. You ever get tired? This passage may help me. I'm sorry, it's the 11th chapter. In verse 11. But along the way, Moses is being tried. Are you going to follow me? Now he's been in preparation for 80 years. And now he's got 40 years of being proved over and over again. Your kids ever get on your nerves? You ever say, I just need a little peace? Emily, you ever say that? I'll guarantee you did. I was there a time or two for him. Especially you get these visitors, these neighborhood kids coming over and causing more trouble. Look what Moses says in verse 11. Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Look at verse 12. This is great stuff here. Did I conceive all these people? Are they my children? Why should I be responsible for them, he's saying. Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give their fathers. Where am I to get meat to give to all the people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry this people from this land, or carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. 2 kids can drive us to that point. Moses had somewhere between 3 and 6 million. He's frustrated. Moses is being proven. I think there's examples for both of us as leaders. Stay true. Strive to be good leaders. Several times throughout the New Testament, people in the church are admonished to help their leaders. I've had leaders in the church tell me it gets to a point where it's just miserable to go to church. Sounds like harsh words. It can get there. Right? We need to help one another. But Moses is being proven. And Moses is setting an example. We use some of these passages this morning, but in Hebrews, the 4th chapter, in verse 1, and I know most of you only have one Bible, and I'm cheating on you up here with 2 and being able to flip back and forth. But in the 3rd chapter, before the verse we really want to get to, the Hebrew writers pointed out the point that although Moses is the greatest leader of all time, apostasy was almost universal, or not almost, was all but universal under Moses. Everyone fell away under Moses. And then he ends the chapter with all these questions, starting in verse 16. For some, when they had heard, did provoke, howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. Verse 17 is where I wanted to start. But with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into the rest? But to them that believed not. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. All these questions are getting us back at this one point. Who fell away? Who fell in the wilderness? That first generation that saw all those amazing miracles. And now the Hebrew writer is writing to the first generation of Christians who saw all the miracles and were living in a very similar time, and he's admonishing them. If they fell away, you can fall away. And so he says in chapter 4 and verse 1, let us therefore fear, lest the promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. He's saying, strive to accomplish it. Moses was being proved. Moses sets an example of faithfulness, and yet by Numbers, the 20th chapter, we see this frustration seem to bubble over, and he's told to provide water through God. He strikes the rock and he says, let us give these people water. The very next verse, God says, because you have not seen to it, believed or had faith to make me holy in these people's sight. What was the sin? Was it striking the rock? I happen to believe that it was more so. Moses is saying, let us deliver water for you. Because of that sin, Moses understands that even leaders must say when they think they stand, and just as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10 and 12, to examine themselves. He who thinks he stands, lest he fall. Moses fell short at this particular time. The example is there for us to strive, to push forward, to do our level best all the time. Now, what's the case here? Some would say that God is such a harsh God because Moses did not enter the promised land because of seemingly this one sin. And if Moses didn't make it to the promised land, I don't have a hope of making it to heaven. I want you to see for sure that God pities Moses. God is merciful on Moses. Brethren, let's be honest. And by the way, this picture, you can't see it very well, but this is from Mount Nebo overlooking the promised land. Our first picture, if I didn't have so many slides, I would go back to it, but Barb at least can appreciate it. Our first picture also was on Mount Nebo looking over the promised land. Moses was 120 years old. He'd put up with these stiff-necked people for 40 years, dragged them through the wilderness. Was it really a punishment? It was time for him to go on to his eternal home. Certainly, God used it as an example. But it's important for us to realize that Moses does not stop at Mount Nebo. You see, standing on Mount Nebo, we know this for sure because Matthew 17, 1 through 8, there we see Jesus on the Mount Transfiguration. And who comes down out of heaven to be with Jesus? Moses. You see, Moses wasn't done. As Moses stood on Mount Nebo, he looked at that earthly rest that were promised to the people. He saw that land that flowed with milk and honey. And I believe Moses also saw that greater reward. Whether he didn't recognize it until he died or whether he knew it was coming, I'm not certain of. But Hebrews 11:26 talks about him having fixed his eyes on that city prepared by God. And Moses went on to that city. Moses understood as he stood on Mount Nebo, there was something ahead, there was something after, there's something above. And Moses was going home to glory. He's a reminder to us that diligence is required. But as Job's blessings were all doubled in his last days, Moses's were more than doubled. He went on to glory. He went on to that promised land. That those people went on into the promised land on earth didn't get to experience for a lifetime to come. Moses would have understood, as Paul wrote in Romans 11:22, the goodness and severity of God. And I think it's good for us to be mindful of the goodness and severity of God. You see, Moses was falling short of his physical goals on earth. That was the severity of God. He was going on to his eternal home, and that was the goodness of God. Surely he could appreciate David's choice, as in 1 Chronicles, the 21st chapter, because David sinned numbering the people, God gives him a choice. He says, David, I will give you 3 years of famine in the land, or I will give you 3 months of conquering at the hands of your enemies, or I will give you 3 days at the edge of the sword of God. What a choice. I believe God could do more damage in 3 days than his enemies could in 3 months, or famine could in 3 years. I believe David knew that. What a beautiful response by David, though. He says, give me the Lord, I will throw myself on his mercy. You see, David understood that he served a merciful God. We know that because he wrote, as Moses experienced here, and surely goodness and mercy shall follow him all the days, and he would dwell in the house of God forever. I'll end with you this last passage of the 11th chapter of Hebrew, verses 15 and 16. Whereof, for they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. Moses was seeking a country. Verse 15, and truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they had come, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly, whereof God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. That's where Moses went. And brethren, God has pity, God has mercy for you and for I. Let's be mindful of the goodness and the severity of God. Let's strive for that heavenly city. And let's be united there for all of eternity in the glory that's going to be revealed in those that are Christ. If you do not belong to Jesus Christ tonight, or if you do and you have some spiritual needs that you want the help of the prayers of this congregation or any other spiritual help that we can offer. Let's make the change tonight that's needed. Let's get you right with God. And let's go on to eternal abode together. If you're subject to the gospel call, then please come forward as together we stand and sing.